Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on what is our first ever live webinar. Before I begin, I would just like to introduce the team that have organised this webinar and will be speaking to you today. Starting with myself, my name is Owen Hennessy. I've been with Astun Technology for 2 years now as a project manager, mainly focused on delivering our iShare in the Cloud projects, which is our fully managed local government and enterprise solution, as well as enterprise metadata projects, which are powered by GeoNetwork 3. So that's the reason I'm here today. With me, I have Vicky White, who is our head of central government and commercial sales. And Vicky will also be speaking to you today after the main presentation to go through those enterprise solutions that we offer. And last but certainly not least is Joe Cook, who's our resident metadata expert and our main presenter for today. Just before I hand over to Joe, I want to add that we'll be keeping about 10-15 minutes at the end, depending on time, for a Q&A session. And you may have already noticed, if you're somewhat familiar with GoToWebinar, if not, don't worry, but you do have the ability to ask questions as well, and type those to us, which I'll be monitoring during Joe's presentation. Hopefully we'll have some time to address those at the end. Vicky will also be providing some email details at the end, if we don't have time to answer your specific question, or if you'd prefer to ask that privately and get an answer in writing. And finally, a recording of this webinar will also be made available after, as well as the slides. So don't feel you have to religiously take notes. We'll be providing that shortly afterwards. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Joe, who will be presenting to you today.
Right, can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Jolly good. Right, okay, so hi everyone. As Owen said, I'm Joe. I am the lead metadata consultant at Astun. I've been at Astun for about 7 years, and over the last few years my focus has mainly been on metadata and working with GeoNetwork, and then more recently with the producing the plugin for GEMINI 2.3, which we'll no doubt be hearing about later. So first of all, I kind of have a question really, which is, you know, we've entitled this webinar Achieving Metadata Nirvana with GeoNetwork and GEMINI 2.3. So what do we mean when we say Nirvana from a metadata perspective? Well, I think we're talking about the ability to create metadata that has real business use, but also to create it quickly and easily. Now, over the last few years, the focus has mainly been on kind of producing metadata to meet Inspire requirements, but what we're talking about here is to actually really harness kind of business use from metadata. So when we say business use, what do we mean exactly? Well, I believe that if we know the provenance and the scope of the data, and something about its quality and its history, then that helps us understand whether the data is suitable for our needs. Then obviously by recording the contact details, people can get at it quickly and easily, and you know, and all of this stuff leads to a lot more business efficiency, a lot less wasted time, and better sharing and discovery of data. So yeah, in this webinar, we're going to be looking at the GeoNetwork metadata catalog, the new release 3.8, and we're going to be looking at the GEMINI 2.3 metadata standard and see how these things might be harnessed to achieve metadata nirvana. So what we're going to cover first of all is a quick overview of GeoNetwork, a very quick overview of the basic functionality. If we were to go into the full functionality, we could spend an entire webinar talking about that. We're then going to talk quickly about the GEMINI 2.3 metadata standard. Then we're going to talk about the additional features that we've put into the GEMINI 2.3 plugin for GeoNetwork, and we'll explain the difference between the two. And then finally, we're going to talk about non-spatial metadata. So as a quick overview of GeoNetwork for those that are possibly not familiar with it, it is by far the leading open source standards compliant metadata catalog. And it's used all around the world for metadata catalogs at all levels, right up to international spatial data infrastructures. So the project is run by a steering committee that comprises a core development team, but also users from around the world. It's an Open Source Geospatial Foundation project, which means that it has passed an incubation process, which is pretty stringent and time-consuming. That process focuses on code quality, but also the sustainability of the project. So what that means for us as users is that we can rely on it. We know that there are going to be regular releases, and also that there's a strong support network of both developers and users that we can go to for assistance. So GeoNetwork can be used for both the creation and storage of both spatial and non-spatial metadata, as we'll talk a bit more about later. And it has endpoints for sharing metadata in both human and machine readable formats. It's got a very powerful interface in itself for discovering and viewing metadata and getting to linked data resources, and for the creation, editing, and publication of metadata records. So let's take a look at the interface. So this is GeoNetwork 3.8, and when we visit it as a kind of a standard user, we're immediately presented with options for discovering metadata by Inspire theme, or by topic, or by most recently updated records, but also we've got a big search box as well. We've also got other search options. So the search tab itself, hopefully you can see there's a little map box in the bottom right that shows you the bounding boxes of the available records. And on the left, we can see all sorts of ways of filtering the metadata. So by type of resource, by topic, by Inspire theme, by keyword, and various things like that. So I'm going to search for a record. So if I search for neighborhood boundaries, these are neighborhood boundaries for police data. And here I can immediately see the title and the abstract, and also the contact for the record. And if I click on the record itself, on the title, then I get to see the details. We've got links at the top that point at associated resources, but also in this case, a WFS link that we can use. And then if we scroll down, we can see various other elements of the metadata, such as the contact for the data itself, the coordinate reference system, contact for the metadata, what languages the metadata in. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the option to download the metadata in various formats. We can display it in a slightly different way, in a more complex view. We've got a quick look at the spatial extent, and we've got the revision date, and also the date that it was last updated. And from this initial view, I can click to add the data to the built-in map. Let me just put some background mapping on. Zoom in. So because this is a WFS layer that we've added, we can load it directly. So let's do that. So this is not this map view isn't a kind of fully featured GIS web-based mapping component, but it does allow you to get a quick glance at the data and make sure that it's fit for purpose. So I'm going to go back to the home page and I'm going to sign in. And as a signed in user, depending on whether I've got the right to, I've got another option, which is the contribute menu, where you can add new records, you can import records if you've got them as XML files that you downloaded from elsewhere. Oops. And here I can edit records. So here's the editing view. And the editing view has some additional features to make life easier for things like adding associated resources, validating the record against whatever metadata standard it is in, and suggestions we'll talk about a bit later on. There's loads of other functionality as well, but as I say, we could spend all day talking about this. So for now, we'll just get back to the presentation. So GEMINI 2.3, a quick overview of it. It is the new metadata standard for spatial metadata in the UK. It's compliant with international standards such as ISO 19115 and INSPIRE. Now, why should you go to the trouble of creating your metadata in GEMINI 2.3? Well, I think that by doing that, you not only ensure the widest compatibility and interoperability with colleagues in other councils or other locations or even other countries, but you benefit from UK-specific guidance and support from the AGI Gemini working group. Now, that's pretty important because metadata standards documentation is generally pretty dry and quite frankly impenetrable. So having some good guidance and UK specific options for metadata is really really important. And interoperability is also vital. You know, data sets represent real world phenomenon such as floods, and floods don't care about boundaries on a map. You know, so being able to guarantee that your data and your metadata are going to be compliant with your neighbours in another country or another organisation is absolutely vital. So there are some changes in GEMINI 2.3 compared to the earlier versions. For example, there are some new elements. I won't go through all of the details, but an example of a new mandatory element is the spatial representation type. Now this is basically the method used to represent the data. So in basic terms, is it a vector, or if it's a raster data, then it may be grid data. Some elements are changing from optional to mandatory, and an example of that is conformity, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Now, conformity is about stating whether your data set is conformant to a product specification. Now that sounds really really obscure, but what we're talking about here is whether it meets, for example, the INSPIRE regulations for a given data set. So that is now a mandatory component. Some elements have had the encoding changed, and examples of these are the use constraints and access constraints. So those are now encoded very slightly differently to how they were encoded previously in GEMINI 2.2. Some elements have actually been renamed, and those include what used to be called the frequency of update, which is now called maintenance information. And then finally, there are guidance changes throughout. There's a lot of guidance changes. So now I'm going to talk about the plugin for GEMINI 2.3 in GeoNetwork. So what that does is it incorporates the technical standards and the validation rules and guidance that we've briefly gone through, and it incorporates those into GeoNetwork itself. But what we've also included is a customized editing interface that, again, I'll show you briefly in the next slide. We've also included some helper functions to make it easier to create and edit metadata. So we at Astun built this plugin with a lot of support from the core GeoNetwork development team, and it's publicly available on GitHub. So if you actually want to include it in your own metadata catalog, then you can do that. So why have we gone to the trouble of building it as a separate plugin? And the reason for that is that it means that as a user, you can have some metadata which might still be in GEMINI 2.2 format, and you can have some metadata which might be in the new GEMINI 2.3 format, and you can store them separately in the catalog. You can validate them against the correct validation rules. And then when you're ready, you can convert between the two. You can also have metadata that might be in the core standard, ISO 19115 or 19139. And again, you can validate that against that standard alone. And then when you're ready, you can convert it to GEMINI 2.3. So it just means that you can keep things a lot more separate and manage them more easily. So some of these enhancements that we've included. So we've basically ensured that all of the labeling aligns with the new name changes, but we've also included some built-in guidance. So I'll go back to this boundary line record I was looking at earlier on, and you'll see in the editing window that we've included some snippets from the AGI GEMINI guidance alongside all of the mandatory elements, so the title, the abstract. But we've also included a link to the page on the GEMINI website, so you can look there for more information. So you can find out exactly what you're supposed to put in, whether it's a character string or a number, is it mandatory, all of that information. So it's not so important for things like the title and the abstract, but when you get down to things like the resource identifier, which is not something that people are hugely familiar with, or maybe if we get down to the access constraints and the use constraints, it's quite confusing to tell the difference between the two. So having the guidance, a direct link to the guidance makes it much easier. So suggestions. Now this is a little wizard that is in the later versions of GeoNetwork, and you can use suggestions for checking for quality as well as validity. So if I go back to my record and I run the suggestions wizard on it, so one of the suggestions that we're including is to check the online resources. So this boundary line link here is no longer correct. So having checked that, we can modify it or remove it. And another check that we've put in is around the keyword fields. And if I scroll down, find the keywords, data quality, lineage. Oh, I've gone past it. Scroll up to find the keywords. Here we go. So keywords are supposed to be separate, but we've got a keyword here which has got two in the same box, mapping, mid scales. So we've got an option here to check that and explode it into two separate keywords. If I run that, then we can see that that's now fixed. So the inflate mechanism is a new feature which has been built into GeoNetwork, and that gives you the option to well, the way that we're using it in Gemini is to ensure that if you accidentally delete a mandatory element, then effectively it's put back in. So if I find the topic category, for instance, this is a mandatory element. So say you accidentally delete it, then the inflate mechanism pops it back in. So it just means that if you make a mistake and you do accidentally delete something, it's not the end of the world, and you don't have to go in and edit the metadata manually in the XML. So we've also built new templates for dataset series and services to match the new standard. And the final thing that I wanted to show you in the Gemini plugin is the code snippets. Now, code snippets are otherwise known as directories. And what they allow you to do is to build little sets of snippets for particular elements in the metadata. So the one that I wanted to show is the conformity element. So I mentioned earlier that this is now a mandatory element. So what we've done is produce snippets to that include the default information for saying that, for example, a network service is compliant with the Inspire implementing rules. So rather than people having to type these elements in manually, they can simply search for them and add them into their record directly. So we've done the same for organizations and contacts. So this allows you to basically create like a little address book. Now, so these two directories that are included as standard in Gemini 2.3, but as the owner of a catalog, you can add your own in. So if you want to create directories for other elements, like for example online resources, then you can do that in this element, in this screen. So the other thing that that I wanted to talk about is non-spatial metadata. So Gemini 2.3 is for spatial metadata, as we've discussed, but that's only half the story. You know, if you're going to get real business use out of your metadata, then you need to be able to store your non-spatial metadata in the same place. There's no point in having metadata in two separate locations, because you're not going to get the same use out of them. So it is possible to store non-spatial metadata in GeoNetwork using the core ISO 19139 metadata standard. This can be used for storing non-spatial metadata. So what we've done, working with DEFRA and the Environment Agency, we've created some stripped down templates so that you don't have to you're not prompted to fill in things like the spatial elements, like the spatial extent or the coordinate reference system. We've also configured an endpoint for publishing non-spatial metadata to data.gov.uk. So again, you can store all of your metadata in one location. And I'm going to show you an example of a non-spatial record in GeoNetwork. So here's one I created earlier in true Blue Peter fashion. So this is a fake metadata record for the Astun Christmas card list. So what we've got here is, as I said, a kind of stripped down set of metadata. So we've included a download to the Google spreadsheet that is the actual spreadsheet in this case. We've got the fields for categories, keywords, language, license and constraints, the kind of things that you're still going to need, the contact for the resource, how frequently is it updated, what format is it in this case, you know, Excel format, who to contact about the metadata, and a nice picture of a dog because why not? This record also shows you another kind of handy feature in GeoNetwork, in the later versions of GeoNetwork, which is the ability to add feedback to a metadata record. And you might be wondering, well, what's the point in that? But this is an easy way for people to comment on the quality of it, to point out errors, you know. So it's a very handy thing. So basically, what we've done is we've gone through what I think are the kind of the pathways to achieving metadata nirvana with GeoNetwork and GEMINI 2.3, which is the enhancements in the various bits of software. So the elements in GeoNetwork that are helpful, GEMINI 2.3 and the enhancements that we've included within the plugin itself to make it easier to use, and also the ability to do things like add non-spatial metadata in, and to do things like have feedback. And now I'm going to hand over to Vicky, who is going to talk more about the kind of business side of things, the business case and our enterprise solutions. So I will make Vicky the presenter and hand over to her. All yours,
Okay.
Vicky.
Thanks, Joe. Just checking you can see the screen and it moving on.
Yep.
So we like to think that we're the experts in enterprise metadata, having provided solutions to the Scottish Government, to DEFRA and the Environment Agency, and to numerous local authorities, a lot of whom are on this webinar today. We offer a wide range of solutions ranging from basic Inspire compliance through to enterprise-wide data discovery as part of a spatial data infrastructure. And our solutions are based on the GeoNetwork technology that Joe's shown and offer full support for the GEMINI 2.3 metadata standards for publishing compliant data to data.gov.uk. You can see the links here. I won't click them now, but once you get a recording of the webinar, you can go through and have an explore of the Scottish Government and the DEFRA and EE sites. If I just do a recap on the business benefit that Joe's gone through, there's many business benefits to be realised from managing metadata from an enterprise perspective, some of which I've listed here. So it enables better decision making through the use of appropriate data, etc., etc. All efforts to organise and manage metadata lead to improved data discoverability across an organisation. And we found that no longer is the information everyone needs in the head of a single individual and lost when they change roles, retire, or win the lottery, for example. Our solutions are primarily cloud hosted and managed by us, removing the need for any additional on-premise technology. They're secure, resilient and scalable should there be a natural disaster in case of the Environment Agency and people looking at flooding, and they all come with performance monitoring. Within our enterprise metadata solutions, you can create metadata, simplify data searches, view, discover and download data, all by managing access to your metadata and thus data more effectively. This is achieved through creation of a metadata catalog in GeoNetwork that's integrated with your desktop and web GIS solutions, allowing users to search for appropriate data, view its metadata, then add the data set to the current map. Examples include the metadata search tool in QGIS and metadata plugins developed for our iShare solutions. Other benefits include dashboard statistics, version control, auditing and the ability to roll back, as well as automated updates and/or reminders. Joe reminded us that metadata is of course not limited to spatial data, and Astun also provides support for non-spatial data with compliance to ISO 19139, as Joe detailed earlier. And to just close this webinar before the question and answer session, we believe that to make the best use of its data, an organisation needs to put in place appropriate enterprise-wide data management. It's widely recognised that metadata is the key to good data governance, as it ensures that users can find and use appropriate data and are aware of its currency, quality and provenance. And with that, I'll pass back over to Owen so he can have a look at the questions that have come in, which you can type in the questions box. And I think Owen will pose these to Joe and then Joe will answer.
Thanks, Vicky. You're very correct. So I hope everyone who's attended has now got a much better picture of what metadata is, how GeoNetwork stores those records in a really great way and with an interface that is really user-friendly and also intuitive to use, especially compared to GeoNetwork 2. We've also discussed the UK GEMINI 2.3 standards for spatial metadata records, but also shown you how you can use GeoNetwork for non-spatial metadata records as well. We've got a few questions come in that I'm going to pose to Joe, but again, as I said in the beginning, if you'd rather ask a question privately or want an answer in writing, just use that email address that's on the screen there. So it's sales@astuntechnology.com. You can also tweet to us at Astun Tech if you'd rather do it that way. And it's probably a good idea to follow us on Twitter as well to get updates if we do webinars like this in the future, and all of the other things that we do as a company as well. So for the first question, Joe, I wanted to ask, for an organization using a shared metadata catalog, can GeoNetwork 3.4 be customized to add additional operational metadata elements for internal business use for only that person using the shared catalog, or is that something that has to be done for all users accessing that catalog?
Okay, so I can answer that one in quite a bit of detail, actually. So this is a question from Andy at Natural England, and which I need to tell you about for the context. So the DEFRA metadata catalog is currently using GEMINI 3.4, but we're looking at an upgrade to GeoNetwork 3.8 next year, early next year. So the way that we add additional metadata elements for internal business use is by extending the GEMINI standard to include those. Now, for the Environment Agency, we have a metadata standard called EAMP, Environment Agency Metadata Profile, that already includes a couple of additional internal business use records. And what we do when we make those records available for publication is we actually strip out those elements. So that's the approach that we take there. So the short answer to the question is that we can extend the GEMINI standard to include additional elements that should be required, and then strip them back out using XSL processing for publication. So hopefully that answers that question. But yeah, we can provide more information by email or whatever if that's needed.
Thanks, Joe. That's great. Next question is from Fliss at Scottish Government. And Fliss is asking if you happen to know if Esri will allow GEMINI 2.3 compliant metadata to be created either through Arc Pro or Arc Desktop. So I guess that's ArcGIS Pro or ArcMap Desktop. Or is this question Fliss should be asking to Esri directly? Fliss said they may not be updating Productivity Suite to meet the new standard.
So I don't know for certain whether Esri will be basically making metadata compliant, but the approach that we take where potentially the input metadata isn't fully compliant is that when we import the metadata into GeoNetwork, again, we can use some processing to make it compliant. So we have that already for GEMINI 2.2, and which basically turns Esri metadata into GEMINI 2.2 compliant metadata. So effectively, we will as a kind of phase 2 to the GEMINI 2.3 plugin, we will be creating processing scripts that work to convert Esri metadata into GEMINI 2.3 or GEMINI 2.2 metadata into GEMINI 2.3. So even if Esri don't output metadata in GEMINI 2.3 standard directly, it's something we will be covering as part of the plugin. But
thanks, Joe. And on the subject of that plugin, someone has asked if that will be supported in future releases of GeoNetwork.
so yeah, the way that we will do that is we will ensure that the plugin is supported in the current stable version, which currently is GeoNetwork 3.8. I happen to know that the plugin is also compliant with, I happen to know that the plugin also works in GeoNetwork 3.4 and 3.6. So basically, we will keep it up to date where possible with the current version and the most recent sort of previous release. Obviously, we don't really know what's going to be in GeoNetwork 4 yet, so I don't know kind of how much work there's going to be in making it compliant, but you know, we aim to support it.
Thanks, Joe. Is it possible to harvest metadata from other third parties, for example, Ordnance Survey, into your own metadata catalogue?
It certainly is, yes. So it's not something that I went into in great detail when I went through the interface, but yeah, there are many options for getting metadata into the catalogue, as well as creating it by hand. You can import metadata if you've got it as XML, for example, but there's also the harvesting mechanism that allows you to harvest in a more automated fashion from third parties. Now, that might be things like other GeoNetwork catalogues. It might be web accessible folders, which is how we harvest Ordnance Survey metadata. Or it could be things like WFS and WMS URLs. Excuse me. So yeah, we've got a number of options there. Another approach that we also do is to allow people to provide metadata as a spreadsheet. Now, we then run some post-processing on that to convert it into XML files. So basically, in that approach, we provide the spreadsheet and so that it's in the correct format, with all the correct columns, with things like drop-down boxes to limit choices where for things like update frequency, and then yeah, so when we then take that spreadsheet and convert the rows in that spreadsheet to XML files and then import them into the catalogue. So there are a number of options for getting metadata in.
Thanks, Joe. And once the metadata records are in there, are there any options for automation within GeoNetwork? Things like email reminders to update those records, or even automated updates entirely?
Yeah, so that's again, it's something that we include in our hosted solution, and we use the GeoNetwork API for that. So it's got a very good API for doing all sorts of things like finding out about the metadata, but also doing updates to it. And the way that we handle email reminders is that we look at the data owner or the metadata owner, and we look at the update frequency, and we look at the update date, and if the update date is older than the update frequency. So for example, if the update frequency is 2 weeks, but the metadata was last updated a year ago, then we consider that metadata to be stale. And we have a Python script that runs as a scheduled task that goes through that list, finds the stale metadata, sends an email to the contact details that are within the metadata record with a link to say, please update your metadata. It's also possible to automatically update the metadata record itself using the API. So for example, if you have a metadata record which represents a data source that is updated daily, let's say planning applications, then you don't really want to have to actually go in and change the date on the metadata record every day. So we can also script that. So it's not something that's possible to do literally out of the box, but we provide options for it and we can build options for it for our hosted customers.
Thanks, Joe. And in terms of interfacing with those records, actually using them in your day-to-day tasks, is there a way of viewing and editing the records that you hold in GeoNetwork in a GIS program, say like QGIS, for example?
So it's definitely possible to view the metadata in QGIS. It's not possible to edit it, which I think is a sensible decision, really, because the viewing endpoint is the CSW endpoint, and that doesn't really have particularly good security on it in terms of preventing people from making changes. So that tends to be locked down to view only. It is possible to get a link to the metadata record though, and so that you can, if you do need to edit it, you can go directly from what you can see in QGIS to the catalogue and then make your changes if you've got permission to do so.
Thanks, Joe. And I think second to last question, can GeoNetwork be configured to understand the incoming data and tag it appropriately? So for example, applying logic to that data if that's been coded.
I think that depends on the nature of how it wants to be tagged and whether, let's say, all of the metadata in a given import needs to be treated in the same way. Generally speaking, if you require sort of some logic and some post-processing, then the easiest approach is to get the metadata in, and then there's a batch processing interface, a batch editing interface that can be used to then select the records that you would need to tag or need to process. So yeah, if I haven't answered the question, then that's probably one that we need to follow up for more of an understanding of what the requirement is.
Thanks, Joe. And it's worth saying, for any of the questions that we've answered today, if you require more detail or you want to expand on those, just drop us an email. And last question for the day is probably the most important. It's how to get on the Astun Christmas card list.
Send biscuits and cake.
Biscuits and cake, fantastic. And I think it may also be a good start to look into the business solutions that we offer, such as the enterprise metadata solution. Again, you can get hold of us through our website. We have a contact link through the email sales@astuntechnology.com or through our Twitter handle, which is displayed on the screen there @AstunTech. Drop us a line, let us know how you currently use metadata, how you'd like that to change, how you would like that to change for the better, and we hope we can help you achieve metadata nirvana with the use of GeoNetwork and GEMINI 2.3. So thanks to everyone for attending, and and we hope to be presenting to you in this format in the near future again soon. Take care. Thank you.